Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to our second channel geography video. This is Evan's series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I actually wanted to talk about New Zealand. New Zealand is a place in the far corner of the world that often gets left out from these sort of discussions, but I found it interesting and I figured it'd be worth doing an empires video because in the same way that European countries like the UK with its overseas territories, France with its overseas collectivities, Denmark and the Kingdom of the Netherlands with its overseas countries, the New Zealand kind of has the same deal going on with a bunch of places around it where they're technically independent countries, but within New Zealand, and they're kind of like New Zealand's little empire. And I figured, given that people don't really think of New Zealand in that way, it'd be a good opportunity to talk about New Zealand, talk about the territories it owns, and just talk about the weird situation that is New Zealand all the way down here in the corner of the world. Because again, this sounds offensive, but I don't mean it in that way. New Zealand is a place that a lot of people honestly forget about because Australia is a very remote continent. It's a very remote island, continent, whatever you want to call it, but it's a very remote country down here in its own little place in the world. The only place it's really even close to is Southeast Asia. As you can see, that's close by, but all the other continents are absurdly far away from it. There's there's Africa over there, there's Asia over there, there's North America, South America, Europe, all really absurdly far. But the crazy thing about New Zealand is for Australia kind of what Australia is to the rest of the world. The distance between New Zealand and Australia, it looks like on a map like they're really close by. They must like fly over and say hello all the time, but the truth is the distance between them. So we'll go from Auckland, the largest city in New Zealand, to Sydney, one of the largest, I think it's the largest city in Australia. It's about 2,100 kilometers, which is pretty absurd, right? It's slightly different depending how you want to do it, but the distance between these islands is over 2,000 kilometers, which means that if you wanted to, if you flew all the way to Australia, the east coast, the furthest east you could get, the time it would take you to get to, Auckland from there would be an extra 4 hours. I looked into the flights and it's like, what? It's a 4-hour flight? Yeah, it's 4 hours from Australia to New Zealand. That's how far apart they are. It's not like the distance between the UK and Iceland, or the distance between even like Germany and Iceland. It's like the distance between the northeast of America, so we'll go from the most northeast point to Greenland. That is the same distance we're talking here. That is just how crazy the distance between New Zealand is and the rest of Australia. And I want to really drive that home, in this first point, because that will then lead into the fact that all of New Zealand's territories are just as remote from New Zealand as New Zealand is from the rest of the world or from Australia. And I just wanted to really drive that point home before we talk about New Zealand and its kind of empire. It's called the New Zealand realm. One of the craziest things that I learned about recently and wanted to share with you all. So yeah, one more thing before we begin. The reason I've started learning about New Zealand a lot recently, the reason I've been looking into it, I'll just be honest with you right now, is because I learned that the longest flight in the world, the longest scheduled flight, actually goes from Doha to Auckland. It's by Qatar Airways. It takes like 17 hours to 18 hours sometimes 16 hours on a lucky fast day. But yeah, 17 hours, let's say on average, and that is such an absurdly long flight. I secretly want to do it, and I might end up doing it at some point soon. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of reference that, like, look how long that flight is. That's how long it takes to get from even a fairly east point, it's called the Middle East, to get to New Zealand. It's that far away from the rest of the world, and it's kind of crazy, right? So yeah, two more things before we begin. The capital isn't Auckland, it's actually Wellington. Auckland was the capital for a brief time in the 1800s. They chose Wellington though because it's a better, midway capital between the two islands. And the other point is that they used the GMT plus 13 time zone, not minus 11. So it leads to this weird issue where they wanted to be friends with Australia and keep the time zone that way, but some of their dependencies are all the way on the other time zone, so they skipped a day at one point. It's crazy stuff. But yeah, let's talk about New Zealand. Let's talk about the fact that first of all, it's actually made up of two islands. I didn't know that like years ago when I first, again, when you look at New Zealand on a huge map, like I've got one on my wall here, I've got one elsewhere, you don't actually see that the two islands are separate because they look like they're absurdly close together. And I know to most of you, you're like, ho, you didn't know there was a North and a South Island in New Zealand? But the truth is, I think a lot of people have that same misconception. So let's get that out of the way right now. There's actually a North-South divide in New Zealand because North Island people kind of see themselves as different to South Island. It's like a friendly rivalry, but the country is in fact made of two islands. And again, same North-South divide where the North Island is both richer, more populous, etc., because they have the largest city where about 1/4 of New Zealand people live, Auckland alone. And New Zealand South Island is more of a, again, less populated, less cities, but more nature and stuff. And yeah, actually, that's the one more thing I want to get into before we start. I know that's like 3 things we've gone into, but New Zealand, the truth is, everyone when they're talking about it, they'll always describe the nature, the beauty and stuff of like, oh yeah, well, did you know that they filmed Lord of the Rings there, and they have deserts and they have crazy cold things and volcanoes, and that is all all cool stuff. But I wanted to kind of talk about the country as a whole. I'm not just talking about like, here's the sales pitch and where you should go there. Although maybe you should go there. I kind of want to go there. But yeah, let's talk about because you know, again, it's quite far away. It's not something everyone can get to. But let's talk about the fact that the two islands, even though it's divided into North Island, South Island, are then further divided to get to this kind of map. So here are all the various regions, the administration, they're called like counties essentially, the councils / territorial authorities of New Zealand. So as you can see, they divide the two islands up. Auckland and Wellington get their own places, and then there's like kind of city regions, kind of not. And interestingly enough, the islands that we're going to be talking about, the dependencies of New Zealand, because a lot of these are dependencies, some of these are like independent countries. The first islands we're going to talk about are the Southland Islands of the, they're called the Stewart Islands. They're part of the Southlands, and like they're mostly not populated, but they are technically a separate island, further yet from New Zealand. And then there's a, you know, a region of New Zealand, which is its whole own, you know, region like this. So it's the least populated of all of them. It's the Chatham Islands, as you can see right there. The Chatham Islands are like, they're in a little box, and it's kind of like America with Alaska and Hawaii, where you're like, oh, they're really close by then, right? Nope, they're all the way over here, and they're their own separate, regional unit. Even though they have only 600 people, it's the least populated by far, and again, not very many people live here, and it's just as far away from, like, so the distance between this and Wellington is about 700 kilometers. So it's got the same kind of distance problem from New Zealand that New Zealand has from the rest of the world, and we're talking about like the second closest island group here that's still a part of New Zealand proper, still a part of a county. This is before we get into the crazy other islands that belong to the south of it. So again, we've got two sets of islands that are part of New Zealand, like, you know, territorial authorities and stuff. Then we're going to talk about the islands to the south here. So again, this is like New Zealand proper now. One more look. Here are all the little areas and territories. Maybe you see a thing of New Zealander. But let's move on to the south, and let's talk about this island right here, because these islands are called the Auckland Islands, the largest one being Auckland Island, which is always confusing when it's like, oh yeah, the Auckland Islands, containing Auckland Island. But my favorite thing is the fact that there's an island just over here where a ship crashed, like a huge trade route crashed, you know, back in the 1800s, and back then, that meant that there was an 18-month wait for the next one. So they decided to name the island where they were stranded for 18 months, by the way. Like, I can't even imagine being stranded for 18 months, but obviously you're this far away from New Zealand, it takes a while to get stuff to you. But they decided to name the Island of Disappointment. So as you can see, Disappointment Island. It's my favorite, just like little thing of like, you know, we're stuck here for 18 months, don't really want to be. Let's just call it Disappointment Island. And yeah, they managed to survive for 18 months. I don't even know how you do that, but they did. And yeah, this is the Auckland Islands, found just to the south of New Zealand. Then we've got one found even further south than that, called the Campbell Island. So this the crazy thing about both these islands though, and the Antipode Island, which is found all the way over there, and it's all the Antipode Islands technically, because again, island thing. The crazy thing about these three islands, which are so small you can barely see them on the map at the same time, right? But the crazy thing about these islands is they're so remote from New Zealand that they all have different, like fauna, like, animals that live there, even though most of them have no land animals, but different sea life, different plant life, not only from New Zealand and from the rest of the world, but from each other in a lot of cases, because there's pretty much no natural way to get from one of these to the other. So let me just show you. Again, I like to use this measure distance thing. Let me just show you. It's 700 kilometers again, just from one of these to the other. Even from the two close by ones, it's 300 kilometers. And again, putting that in perspective, is just a really far distance away, and these are just the close by ones. So then we go to the north of this, and we end up with the, you probably just saw the accidental, page earlier. Then we get to the Kermadec Islands, which are found just to the north here. I have problems like finding them on a map because they're so far to the north. Again, same thing going on here. If we measure the distance, it's a similar distance from New Zealand than it actually is from New Caledonia. So also as a fun fact, by the way, the closest country to New Zealand, by technicality, is actually France, unless we include Australia. But the closest island that they don't border directly is actually France. So yeah, France and New Zealand, surprisingly close by. France comes up in every one of these videos because they still hold on to their territories and they still call it officially France. Although actually New Caledonia is holding a referendum this year. Maybe you'll see a country. Statistically not likely, but still, fun little thing. There's New Caledonia, maybe the new independent country of the region. But yeah, New Zealand, all the way down here, also owns, like I just said, the Antarctic, owns like a tiny slice of Antarctica, but also doesn't, but also does. So Antarctica Treaty, really complex thing, signed in the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, because neither of those countries had interest in Antarctica, where they said, oh yeah, no claims anyone, and everyone signed it, but no one officially renounce their claims. So you have this really weird situation where, like, here is the map of Antarctica, where no one owns Antarctica, but all these people kind of own Antarctica, and also Argentina and Chile, like, their claims overlap the UK's. But let's just not think about that. Let's instead talk about the fact that New Zealand owns a very peaceful part of Antarctica, where it's just unclaimed to the left here, like this is unclaimed Antarctica, and it's got a little slice of Australia nearby, and then guess what? Here's France again. Come and say hello to New Zealand one more time, because they're just friendly pals like that. But no, the crazy thing about the New Zealand part of Antarctica is even though it is the, again, it's one of the smaller slices, and it's, again, all the way over here, it actually has one of the largest bases, which can situate like 2,000 people. It looks like this. It's really tricky to see, but there's like a lot of like people that technically live there sometimes, and that's kind of crazy if you ask me. That in the most remote part of the most remote country, because again, this is technically New Zealand, that they actually have some of the largest capacity in Antarctica. And again, it's 3,000 kilometers from New Zealand, which is already so far from everyone else. And the truth is if you wanted to get to New Zealand, Antarctica, you just wouldn't go via New Zealand. Like the fastest way to get from here, like even from like the US, for instance, it takes you a very weird route, because obviously when you're talking about the south of the poles, you get very weird things going on. So it's faster for the from the US, from Washington DC, to just go over New Zealand from over here and just kind of skip it like that. So, oh sorry, over Antarctica. Antarctica and New Zealand, distinct places. So there you go, fun fact, New Zealand owns Antarctica, which is the weirdest one of its like claims right there. But what's even weirder is the fact, well, it's not weirder, I should say, I guess, because it's the Kermadec Islands. These are some islands found just to the north of New Zealand, and they were at one point very, like populated, because again, the islands in the Pacific all had Polynesian people like go to and from them. Again, it's a really small island, but I don't know how that keeps happening, but they had Polynesian people who originally settled there, somehow got from island to island, started to populate, but, in the early 19th century, early 20th century, sorry, the population was finally done, and the British wanted to use it to test nuclear missiles, because, like, it's just, it's a gone place. It's a place you can visit if you really want to, but that no one lives there properly, so it's just a very, 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 very remote part of New Zealand. That's weird, that keeps happening, but very, very remote part of New Zealand. So let's move on next to talk about the dependent countries of New Zealand, because we've kind of spoken about like things that are still New Zealand. Like this isn't odd stuff, like this is normal, like countries own islands nearby them, like this isn't an empire, but the empire really comes when you talk about countries that are fully dependent on New Zealand. So there are 3 of these that exist. The most famous example are the Cook Islands. Even though only 17,000 people live here, they're famous because they have a lot of scuba diving. It's a very picturesque place, and they have a higher tourist population than their main population by such a significant amount. Like, there's almost 100,000 visitors every single year, but, compare that to population, that's like 6 times the visitors. That's the same as if the US got 1.8 billion visitors a year. Put that in perspective as to how crazy that would be. And yeah, here's one of the main island. They also have their own currency, but it's just... It's on par with the New Zealand dollar, so it's essentially not their own currency. And they also are their own country. Like, people are like, I'm from the Cook Islands, but they're just a part of New Zealand, but also not, because they've got that whole kind of like empire deal where it's like, well, we manage all the currency and defense, and then you do your own stuff after that. Same with Niue, got the same kind of deal going on. It's a very small, very rough nation. It's got some real issues, and we've brought it up before on this channel. It's just one of these weird, like, oh yeah, belongs to New Zealand, even though they don't really have much of their own stuff going on. Only 1,600 people live here. And then finally, we've got Tokelau to the north. And I find this to be a fascinating example of a country, because it's a country made up of atolls only. So it's a group of atolls, and again, there's countries like this elsewhere. Kiribati comes to mind, but it's just a variety of atolls that came together to make a country. And again, there's only 1,400 people living across all of these, and they think they're an independent country. And New Zealand thinks they're an independent country, but the UN doesn't recognize that to be a fact, because the New Zealand, again, their currency is the NZD, New Zealand dollar, and it just leads to this very weird situation where, like, if a country thinks it's independent, and, like, the country which supposedly it's under thinks it's independent, is it independent? And I guess the answer is no, but I mean, it's one of those, like, interesting ones to bring up. But yeah, they're made up of atolls. Atolls, if you don't know, they're like islands, but the middle part of the island is below water again. So of a country that looks like this, and I don't know, that's just, it's not a concept you think about, because everyone always pictures those islands in the middle of the sea, but no, this is made up of atolls in the middle of the sea, and they think they're independent, but they're not independent. But I mean, like, what is independence really? Apparently not what Tokelau has. So there you go, there's the 3rd country within the New Zealand realm, and honestly, one of the more interesting examples of it's all gone again. One of the more interesting examples of like how a country exists, because the territory of a country, like, any mainland country, like look at China, easy to work out what it belongs. Maybe a bad example. Look at Mongolia. You're like, oh yeah, clear markers of like, that's Mongolia. But when you have a country that is made up of 2 islands to begin with, and then has lots of islands piled on as like territories, and then has islands piled on as like countries that belong to us, but not really, then where do you end up begin with that country? And the simple answer is just, this is New Zealand, and that's not New Zealand. Well, that's like kind of New Zealand, and that's like not really New Zealand, but sure, if you want to call it New Zealand, fine. And speaking of not New Zealand, I should mention before we go here, it would be a big shame if we didn't miss out the fact that the one thing that I feel like New Zealand people are most upset by is the fact that there is a lot of maps in the world that don't include New Zealand. It's a really famous Reddit thing, you've maybe heard of it. It's called Maps Without New Zealand, so here are the top links of all time, and there's a bunch of maps in the world where they just don't include New Zealand. So here's a Nutella map where they're like, look, here's a map of the world, guess what, New Zealand, because it's just a well-known little thing. And one of the things that I didn't know until I also, Traveller held in Kazakhstan, as they didn't believe New Zealand existed because it wasn't on their map. Real story, by the way, I looked into it. But the craziest thing to me that I only found out when I checked the subreddit just before the video is the fact that the New Zealand government, for 404 page, so there's like a bunch of these on here, actually doesn't include New Zealand on their map of the world. So as you can see, it's missing like the Baltic Sea too. But for instance, yeah, no New Zealand on the New Zealand government map. And there's just something perfect about that, right? But yeah, anyway, with that said, that is New Zealand. That is the countries it owns and the places it owns. And New Zealand is a place, like I said, I'm very, you know, let's just say I'm going there this June. Like I'm gonna deal with like the booking it in like a few days time. So if you live in New Zealand or will live in New Zealand in June, particularly Auckland and the volcano, I think it's I forget the name of the volcano. But if you live in Auckland, let's just say, let me know. Send me an email, ibx2cat@gmail.com. And like, I don't know, if you want to get a drink and like tell me things about your country. I actually met a couple of Singaporean subscribers in Singapore. I figure maybe do the same thing in New Zealand. If you're down, you want to tell me things about your country, want to show me a cool thing, then yeah, New Zealand in June, send me an email, ibx2cat@gmail.com. Because I think it's really cool to like meet people who are subscribed to the channel and like, again, it's a really interesting thing to like put, it's you know, because when you're talking to the internet, I'm just talking to a camera right here. It's like, you know what, I'm just saying things I find fascinating. But it's cool to see people on the other end of that. So yeah, if you live in New Zealand, in particular, again, Auckland, because it's the big city, I'm gonna be taking I'm hoping, again, I'm like trying to deal with it right now. Because again, it's such a long flight. Like it's like making me a bit nervous thinking about it. But I want to do the 17-hour like just mess off a flight to get there. Is it a mess? I don't know. But yeah, if you want to meet me on the other side over here in Auckland, let me know, because I'd love to say hi. So thank you very much for watching. There's my shameless plug for my. That's not even a plug, is it? That's me saying like it'd be cool to meet. But anyway, if you want to meet me, let me know. And I guess I'll see you all in the next video. Wait, before I go, this one has to come up because, you know, I talk about flags a lot on this channel, and one of the most notable things about New Zealand is its flag and its lack of changing the flag. So here's the current, and I guess now just the New Zealand flag as it is. As you can see, it's got the UK, the Union Jack / the Union flag in the top left over there. Rather interesting thing. I think it's nice. It welcomes me to maybe come to the country, but it's also got the rather interesting, you know, distinction of having a referendum to change the flag. They had a bunch of designs to change it, but they had such a flawed referendum that it ended up being like a choice between this flag and then their existing flag, and then people were like, you know what, I don't really like, you know, they split the vote between like 2 flags like this. It was a flawed referendum. I don't like the referendum, and I don't like this flag more than their current one, but like I just feel like they could have done something about their flag, but they didn't. They did it bad, and I just wanted to mention that because yeah, you can't mention New Zealand without mentioning the flag. And I don't know, I think this would have been a solid flag though. I would have voted for this. So if you didn't, you voted wrong. Anyway, flags, fun fact, they had a flag referendum. I don't know when the last time that happened is, but it happened with New Zealand. So anyway, second channel, don't care. Bye.